Thomas pointed at the woman kneeling by the well, her dress little more than gray thread and dust, and he laughed, the loud, careless laugh of a man who had never gone a day without bread. "Look at her now," he said to anyone who would listen, "the great weaver, dressed like a beggar." Martha said nothing. She only lowered her eyes and let the water jug fill, because some truths are too heavy to carry in front of a crowd. But before Thomas could finish enjoying his cruelty, a stranger's voice cut through the marketplace. "Do you know," the merchant called out, stepping down from his cart, "what she gave up so that your children could eat this winter?" The square went silent, and in that silence, the whole town finally understood what Martha had sacrificed, and what she had never once asked anyone to thank her for. Stay with me, because before we return to that moment at the well, you deserve to know how it began. And if stories like this one move you, consider subscribing, so you never miss where they lead. Let's go back to the beginning, to the season before the drought, when Martha's golden dress was still just a beautiful thing, and not yet a secret worth keeping. Martha was the finest weaver the town had ever known. Her fingers moved across the loom the way a river moves around stone, patient, certain, unwilling to be stopped by anything so small as doubt. People traveled from neighboring towns to buy her cloth, carrying home shawls and blankets that seemed to hold light even after the sun went down. Yet though she lived in a tidy little house at the edge of the market road, she was never short of visitors who wanted something from her hands. What they rarely wanted was her company. Martha had grown used to being admired from a distance, the way one admires a well-made tool rather than a friend. And over the years, she had stopped expecting anything more. Of all the things she had ever made, none was as famous as the one dress she had not made at all. It had belonged to her mother, Naomi, who had woven it from threads spun with real gold before Martha was even born, back when the family owned land and cattle, and a name people said with respect. Naomi had died when Martha was still a girl, and the golden dress was the only inheritance she left behind, folded carefully at the bottom of a wooden chest, like a piece of her mother's own heartbeat. Martha wore it only on feast days, when the whole town gathered to eat and dance beneath strings of lanterns. And each time she slipped it on, she felt her mother standing just behind her shoulder, watching with quiet pride. "This is all I have left of you," she would whisper to the folded cloth on ordinary nights, smoothing its threads with careful fingers, "and I will never let it go." For years, that promise cost her nothing to keep. The town was prosperous. The rains arrived when they were supposed to. The markets stayed full of millet and mangoes and laughter. And envy toward Martha's golden dress was the closest thing to hardship most people ever experienced. Thomas, a proud man who owned the largest herd of goats in the region, often joked that Martha's dress was worth more than his entire farm. And privately, he suspected he was right. He said it with a wide smile, but there was an edge tucked beneath it, the particular resentment of a man who believed that inherited beauty was somehow less earned than his own calloused hard work. Then, one dry season, the rains simply did not come. At first, no one worried. Dry seasons had visited before and passed without lasting damage, leaving behind nothing worse than a few weeks of dust and complaint. But the weeks became months, and the riverbed that once fed the fields cracked into a map of gray, thirsty lines. Crops that should have stood tall and green by harvest instead withered in their rows, brittle and pale, like something already dead but too stubborn to fall over. Grain that used to cost a few coins began to cost 10 times as much, and then more than that, until even families who had once considered themselves comfortable found their storerooms nearly bare. Martha watched it happen from her loom, weaving cloth that fewer and fewer people could afford to buy. She heard the change in the town's voice before she ever saw it in the fields. Mothers speaking softly outside her window about how far a single sack of maize could stretch. Children asking questions their parents did not want to answer. Even Thomas, who had always walked through the market like a man who owned the ground beneath his sandals, began to move more carefully, his once proud herd of goats thinning as he sold them off one by one just to keep his own family fed through the coming weeks. "We will manage," people told each other, the way people always do when they are afraid to say anything else out loud. But manage became a smaller and smaller word as the drought stretched into its fourth relentless month. An elderly widow near the well fainted from hunger one morning, and had to be carried home by two neighbors who themselves had not eaten properly in days. Two brothers who used to laugh together over card games now argued bitterly in the street over the price of a single scrawny hen. And late one evening, Martha overheard Thomas standing just outside her window, his usual pride cracked for a single unguarded moment, murmuring to no one in particular, "I don't know how much longer we can hold on like this." That was the night Martha took the golden dress down from its shelf and looked at it for a very long time. She thought about her mother's hands, weaving each careful thread by lamplight. She thought about the promise she had made alone in her house, never to let it go for as long as she lived. And then she thought about the widow who had collapsed by the well, and the children whose stomachs growled louder now than their laughter ever had. A weaver spends her whole life turning ordinary thread into something useful, she realized, staring up a shimmering fabric in her lap. What use was gold thread hanging untouched in a dark house, while people she had known her entire life went hungry right beside her? She did not tell a single soul what she had decided. Pride, she understood now, was not only a flaw that belonged to men like Thomas. She carried her own kind of it, quieter, but just as stubborn, and she did not want to be thanked, or pitied, or questioned about her choice. She wanted only to solve the problem sitting in front of her, the same way she solved every problem in her life, with her own two capable hands and nobody else's opinion. Word had reached the town that a merchant from the city, a sharp-eyed man named James, was traveling through the drought-stricken region buying rare goods to sell abroad, where gold thread and fine weaving still fetched an honest price. Martha waited until dusk, wrapped the golden dress in plain cloth so no curious eyes could recognize it along the road, and walked quietly to the edge of town where his cart sat camped for the night beneath a lone acacia tree. "I have something to sell," she told him, keeping her voice steady, "but I need this to stay between the two of us." James unwrapped the bundle carefully, and his breath caught audibly when the fading light caught the gold threads. "This is extraordinary work," he said, turning it over in his hands. "Are you certain you wish to part with it?" "I'm certain I wish to feed my neighbors," Martha answered simply. "Whether I wish to part with it is a different question entirely, and not one that matters very much right now." They agreed on a price that was, by any fair measure, less than the dress was truly worth, because Martha did not have the patience left in her to negotiate, and James, to his credit, did not try very hard to lower it further once he understood exactly why she was selling. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Martha's golden dress was gone, folded away into the merchant's cart, along with a promise he fully intended to keep. And in her own hands instead was more coin than she had ever held at one time in her life. She used almost none of it on herself. Within 2 days, wagons of grain began arriving at the edge of town, purchased, the driver explained to a curious crowd, by an anonymous benefactor who wished only that the food be distributed fairly among every family, starting with those who had the very least. No one thought to connect the sudden shipment to Martha, who continued weaving quietly at her loom, as if nothing at all had changed in her life, even as everything had. The widow by the well ate a proper meal that week for the first time in a month. The two brothers stopped arguing over a single hen, because there was finally enough for both their households and their children besides. Even Thomas's family received their fair share, though he never once thought to wonder, not yet, whose sacrifice had actually made it possible. For the first time in months, the whole town seemed to breathe a little easier. Children played in the dust again, instead of standing silently beside their worried parents. Someone even suggested holding a small feast to celebrate their sudden good fortune, though no one could quite explain where it had truly come from. Martha said nothing at all. She simply wore, day after ordinary day, the plainest dress she still owned, the only one left in her small house now that the golden one was gone for good. It was during that quiet, unremarkable stretch of days, gray to everyone but her, that Thomas happened to see her at the well one morning, and noticed, perhaps for the first time in years, exactly what she was wearing. "Where is your famous dress, weaver?" he asked, and a smirk was already forming, the beginning of a joke he assumed would land easily among the gathering crowd. When Martha only shook her head and reached for her water jug without offering an answer, his smirk widened into something considerably crueler. He raised his voice so everyone nearby could hear him clearly, the same way he always had whenever he wanted an audience for his wit. "Look at her now," he said, "the great weaver, dressed like a beggar." Martha said nothing. She only lowered her eyes and let the water jug fill, because some truths are too heavy to carry in front of a crowd, and she had never once intended for this particular truth to be carried at all. But fate, or perhaps simple timing, had other plans that morning. James the merchant had returned to town that very week to trade for fabric ahead of his next journey, and he arrived at the well just as Thomas's laughter was rising toward its cruelest point. The stranger's voice cut through the marketplace like something breaking clean in two. "Do you know," he called out, stepping down from his cart, "what she gave up so that your children could eat this winter?" James told them everything, unable to stay quiet, while a woman who had saved his own conscience along with the entire town was mocked openly in front of him. He told them about the golden dress, wrapped carefully in plain cloth at dusk. He told them about the price Martha had barely bothered to negotiate, because feeding her neighbors had mattered to her far more than protecting her own inheritance. He told them exactly where every sack of grain that had filled their storerooms for the past 2 weeks had truly come from, and whose name deserved to be spoken with the gratitude they had, until this very moment, offered to no one in particular. Thomas's smirk collapsed into something closer to shame than he had felt in years. He looked at Martha, at the plain, threadbare dress he had mocked only moments earlier, and understood, all at once, that he had been laughing at the very proof of her sacrifice. "I didn't know," he said quietly, and for once, there was no pride left in his voice to hide behind. "That was rather the point," Martha replied gently, because she had never wanted credit for it, only for her people to eat through the winter. The town did not let her sacrifice go unanswered for long, though. In the weeks that followed, families who had once simply admired Martha's skill from a comfortable distance began arriving at her small house with something more than empty compliments. They brought lumber and tools and the labor of their own 2 hands, insisting that a woman who had given up everything she owned for their sake deserved something lasting in return. Even Thomas came, quieter now than anyone had ever seen him, offering the strength of his remaining herd and timber from his own land without needing to be asked twice. Together, thread by thread and beam by beam, the whole town built Martha a proper weaving school at its very center, a place where she could finally teach her craft to the daughters and sons who had once only watched her work through a window from outside. If there is a lesson worth carrying out of Martha's story, it is simply this: true wealth is never measured by what a person keeps hidden away, but by what they are willing to give when it matters most. Martha's golden dress was beautiful, yes, but it remained only cloth and thread until the moment she chose to let it become something far greater than either. It was in the giving, not the owning, that her mother's inheritance finally found its true and lasting worth. Martha never wore gold again after that season. She did not need to. She had become, in the eyes of the entire town, something far more valuable than a woman in a beautiful dress. She had become the very heart of the community she had once only watched from a careful distance. And every single thread that passed through her hands from that day forward carried a little of that golden generosity along with it. Thank you for staying with Martha's story until the very end. If it moved you even half as much as it moved me to tell it, share it with someone who needs a reminder that giving is its own kind of wealth. And I will see you in the very next story.